Nixon resigns, OPEC, Aramco, the Yom Kippur Wars. I contend in the research I've done that this wasn't coincidence. As Nixon's trying to figure out a way to break free of the puppet master, he actually hired someone into the Atomic Energy Commission to figure out what's going on in there that they're scared of. And Dixie Ray Lee was the woman who was governor later of Washington State, who has a photographic memory, an amazing book by her. She's trying to figure out some of these things because Nixon put her there, but she could never get together with him because all these other things were going on. If they had gotten together, they might have pieced it together, but it wasn't to happen. So let me zip by this. So I want to give you 4 minutes here of this gentleman, Why Nations Fail. He's going to talk about what makes a good country that will succeed versus one that would fail. It's about 4 minutes.
Say a few more things, laying the seed. So our theory is actually quite simple. It's about incentives, economic incentives and political incentives, and those incentives are shaped by institutions, broadly the rules of the game in a society in the economic, social, and political sphere. In the economic sphere, we talk of inclusive economic institutions. Inclusive economic institutions are those that enforce property rights, that have judicial and contracting institutions that uphold contracts and enable individuals to enter into mutually beneficial agreements. And quite importantly, perhaps most importantly, they provide a level playing field, both in terms of regulations that don't prevent people from entering into businesses and occupations that are best for themselves, and providing the right sort of investments in public infrastructure and education and so on that make it possible for the population at large to participate in the economic game. And it's no surprise that I think inclusive economic institutions with these level playing field are really important, because if you look at sustained economic growth, growth in the long run that lasts not for just a couple of years, nor not just for a decade, but for extended periods of time, it's based on technological change, it's based on innovation, it's based on creative destruction. So any society that only uses the energy and creativity of a small fraction of its population is not going to be significantly prosperous in the long run. But the catch is that most societies throughout history, or even today, aren't ruled by inclusive economic institutions. They're ruled by extractive economic institutions that do the opposite. They don't create secure property rights, at least not for the majority of the population. They don't create a legal environment that upholds contracts, or they create an environment that's very biased. And most of all, they create a very tilted playing field where the politically powerful are protected by entry barriers, and the politically powerful have all the resources and get all the education, get all the rights to enter into the lucrative occupations and businesses. And of course, the word extractive here is not chosen by not chosen randomly. The idea that we want to communicate is that these institutions aren't there by mistake. They have been designed for a purpose, precisely to reallocate resources, redistribute resources from the majority of the population for the benefit of the politically few, whom we sometimes refer, or often refer to in the book, as the elite. And the reason why these extractive economic institutions don't support economic growth, sustained economic growth, is that because they don't generate the sort of innovation, they block technological change, and they don't create a secure property rights and the contracting environment for the majority of the population to take advantage of their talents and skills. In fact, quite the opposite throughout history. They create such a tilted playing field that much of the population is actually coerced for the benefit of the minority. And these extractive economic institutions don't exist in a vacuum. They are supported by a specific set of political institutions, which, to emphasize the sort of the symbiotic relationship between the two, we call extractive political institutions. Extractive political institutions are those that concentrate political power in the hands of a narrow elite and don't create political equality. They don't create checks and balances or constraints on the exercise of power. And you see why these two are going to create feedbacks between the two. Let's consider a specific example. The United States, just like Britain and a few other economies, had a much more secure set of property rights. The patent system, for example, which encouraged innovations in the United States was just the tip of that iceberg, but was very important because of its symbolic value. It enabled people from all walks of life to be able to say, okay, this is my invention, and I will be able to market it, or I will be able to open a business on the basis of it and scale it up. What was quite important for the United States in the 19th century is that even when there were periods in which economic inequality and political inequality increased, political power wasn't so monopolized in the hands of a narrow group that they could call all the shots and block innovation, block technological change, block new investments.
That fails is the one who suppresses technologies, that stops new technologies from destroying and refurbishing the older technologies. And I figure that has cost the United States, in my own calculations, between 1974 and today, it has cost the United States about $20 trillion. That's more than the national debt. So federal government, as he was saying, this is how we finished up in Maine, saying that American exceptionalism is going to lead the world in GALT development. We need the federal government to remove artificial barriers that are still there in place from 1974. Before these politicians left, and they abolished the Atomic Energy Commission, Joint Commission on Atomic Energy. They put in some laws saying you can't look at thorium. You can only look at light water reactors and the fast breeder reactors, but you can't look at GALT. So we have those battles to do. So we got to educate the American public on the hows and whys. They were purposely turned against atomic energy. Everyone's frightened and scared of atomic energy, and I contend that was not an accident.
And you're still not concerned that the rest of the world is trying to take this technology, and they may just beat us to the punch, and it's not going to matter anyhow.
Take a look at rare earth metals. The reason we lost all that overseas is because when you pull up that material, there's thorium in it. So thorium
Because we
hit us.
stopped mining it here, right? We have plenty of it.
We can mine it, but we have to ship it. We can't process it. So in closing, we now flash back to 1934 and 1946. In 1934, Ayn Rand boasted that she was the first writer ever perfect the art of building a story in 3 tiers. May 18, 1934, and she's 29 years old. And a plot of a story is simple and understandable enough to be interesting alone by itself, even the lowest type of mentality. The same is true if a plot carries a deeper meaning. It can be reached only by the highest, but she goes on in her letter. Oh, I must have jumped over that. But she's saying, I'm able to write in all my stories a 3rd level. Almost, to me, a DaVinci level, where if something special occurs, it might trigger an understanding of what was going on there. If the elites could not control Oppie, they would expose him as a clown in the eyes of the American people. They took Jerry Voorhis, who was a supporter and would have been a president probably in 10 or 12 years if he had continued, who was Kid Atlas. He had legislation against communism. Nixon painted him as a communist. And after he won by a small margin, he said, I knew he wasn't a communist. He was a patriot, but I had to win. They were now attacking Oppie. Same thing. You're a communist. You may have given plans to Russia. whatever they could do to get him out. So I had contended at one point in time, just before Roosevelt's death, he sent a telegram, a note, something to Oppenheimer saying essentially, whether he was at Warm Springs, Missouri, which they also called the White House to Oppenheimer stop, Joint Operational Homeland Nuclear stop, geothermal atmospheric liquefied thorium stop, initiate strategy. And so this is created by me based on the evidence I've seen. And I've seen Robert with his typewriter that has the R off a little bit. So I pulled that in. Happy to accept, Robert Oppenheimer. So this is, be it this form or some other form, this is to communicate, because there's some things going on that we won't get into here because it'll be later, but the British are involved in this, but the British are coming. So it's a moment of deep despair. Oppie, he realizes he's being cornered. The military have been investigating for years. The FBI is now starting to bug his office, his home soon in the next few weeks. There'll be thousands of pages of illegal reports that we've learned in books hence of all the illegal things they were doing against Oppenheimer to try and get him discredited. He realized he's cornered, and what is he going to do? And about this time, he's in the second interview, I contend, with Ayn Rand, who he knows is brilliant. He knows that she's bragged about being able to do a DaVinci Code-like stuff. So I contend he spilled the beans, the atomic beans, concerning his terrible premonition of the future to this brilliant writer. He likely had showed her his last communique and explained that I'm doing this based on what the prior president wanted. Truman was brought in to replace another vice president thanks to the British, who didn't want, that's another long story. Bottom line is he thought maybe there's an opportunity here. So the fact that AR successfully hid a second copy of her screenplay, top secret from everyone for half a century, suggests Oppie likely warned her that he didn't think the Truman administration was ever going to let her get it out because they're cutting down information. They don't want information released. That is exactly what happened. March 19, 1946, parts of the manuscript would eventually be found in the Truman archives. There were like 16 pages. She's doing this for a guy named Barris who did Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon. And they came in and gave him the equivalent of $250,000. We want that. And don't do anything else on it. So she's ticked at her producer for doing that, so she'll leave him eventually. But anyway, that's another story. The impact, let's see, two brilliant minds, century understanding, neither would, and this is the other thing. They never see each other again. They never speak of this. Because if she writes it and gets it in, but it's discovered, what will be the ramifications? So Ayn Rand did slip up one time. She mentioned interviewing Oppenheimer for her screenplay Top Secret in 1961. That's been noted. But it wouldn't be till 18 years after her death, in 1998, that one of the Atlas Shrugged Society people is in her garage because she's willed her journals and letters and everything over. He finds a box. He opens it up. And lo and behold, she worked on the Manhattan Project. It was her screenplay. She had made a second copy. So, oh, and with Ayn Rand, her Atlas Shrugged, when I say she does 3-layer books, would you be interested